Hi, so welcome. Today we are here with Keith Syska, who is an Lsat tutor and instructor, and he is going to talk to us a little bit about the Lsat and preparation for it. And I'm just going to turn it right over to him.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Watson. As she mentioned, my name is Keith Syska, and I'm the founder of Last Call Bar Academy, which is a company that is dedicated to helping people become attorneys. And so if you're interested in going to law school and becoming an attorney, I'm the guy to chat with. And I want to talk to you guys today about one of the big obstacles in that process, which is the LSAT. And what I hope to do is give you a 30-minute presentation in which I give you the most important things that I can cram into 30 minutes. Obviously, there's much more to learn about the LSAT than what I can share in 30 minutes, but I'm coming in with the assumption that people who watch this are not very knowledgeable about it and need to kind of start with the basics. So I'm going to talk about four things today. Who am I? How did I learn so much about the LSAT? Why should you care about the LSAT if becoming an attorney is your goal? And then I want to talk about what's on the test. What kinds of things does it test and what's on each section? So let's start with a little bit about me. I've been teaching test prep for more than 20 years. I had a student one time say that, oh, so you're basically a professional test taker, which I thought was a funny description, but it's really true. Way back since college, I've been teaching people how to learn the content for exams and learn the strategies for exams. After college, I taught MCAT for many years. I learned most of the high school tests, the SAT, ACT, and AP exams, and I taught high school for many years. But eventually I found the exam that really piqued my interest, and that was the LSAT. The LSAT proved to be the most formative exam for me, both intellectually and professionally, because it led me to law school. It led me to eventually start my company, Last Call Bar Academy. And it led me to my interest in the LSAT, in law school testing, and in the bar exam. So what I try to do is help people at all steps of the process. I help them get into law school by helping them get a good LSAT score. I help them succeed in law school with their 1L exams, and then that carries over to the bar exam. And I help people ultimately pass the test and get licensed. So at Last Call, we offer a whole suite of products, starting with the LSAT. And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit more about now, the LSAT, and why it's such an important consideration if you're trying to become a lawyer. There's really two things that you have to understand about the LSAT, and I think one of them is widely known and the other is not. The first thing is that the LSAT is, at most law schools, the most heavily weighted component of the application. So when they get your application and they're thinking about all the different things, your GPA, your major, what clubs you belong to, what graduate degrees you have, et cetera, the one thing that's going to make the biggest impact on whether you get in or don't get in is your LSAT score. In fact, your LSAT score makes an even bigger contribution at most schools than your GPA does. The rationale being that it's standardized, whereas they can't necessarily compare your GPA to someone from a different school or from a different major. So the LSAT score is a very important component just to getting in. But here's the part that I don't think most people know, and this is what we were talking about before we started the recording today, and that's that the LSAT is the key to making law school affordable for most people, unless you have some independent wealth or GI Bill or some way to finance law school other than loans. The main source of financial aid is going to be merit aid from the law schools, and law schools give merit aid for highly qualified applicants. In other words, high GPAs and, more importantly, high LSAT scores. Now, even if people kind of understand that there are scholarships for law school, I don't think most people understand how much cost shifting goes on here. I don't think most people understand how much of the law school class is receiving scholarships and how large these scholarships are. And so it gives people the impression that they have to finance law school independently, either through loans or through work and savings. But I just went and pulled the statistics from my law school, just to use one example. Texas Law School, the 509 report from last year, 2021 report, said that 28% of the students at the law school were receiving grants or scholarship worth half the tuition up to full tuition. 28%. That's more than a quarter of the class is getting 50% or more of a discount on their tuition from grants and scholarships. So the way that I view it is that the people who go to law school and pay the full freight are essentially subsidizing the cost for the people who receive the scholarships. And some people can certainly afford to pay the full tuition, but I wasn't in that circumstance. I needed scholarships to make it affordable, and the LSAT was really the key to doing so. So I received a full tuition scholarship at University of Texas, and that's how I financed my education, through scholarship, not through loans, or at least not loans for my tuition. Living expenses are a whole nother matter. And that's why it's so important to make the tuition as inexpensive as possible. All right, so how do you go about doing that? You have to think about what's actually on the LSAT. How can you get better at performing on that test? So let's talk briefly about the individual sections of the exam. There are 3 different types of sections on the LSAT. And one thing I want to make sure that everyone who watches this comes away with is a very clear understanding of what these sections are called, because a lot of times students contact me and they're not even clear about what the sections are, or what we should call them. So the 3 sections are called analytical reasoning, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension. Over the years, the test creators have packaged these 3 sections in different combinations. Sometimes the LSAT had 5 sections, sometimes it had 4 sections, sometimes it's had 3 sections, but it's always had some combination of these 3. That hasn't changed in a very long time. So colloquially, these sections have become known as logic games, arguments, and reading comprehension. And I think that in our attempt to simplify the names, we've actually created some confusion for students, because sometimes I'll have students come to me and say, I need help with the logical reasoning. And then they're really talking about logic games. And so the whole thing has just become rather confusing. But analytical reasoning is the logic games section. And when we call it logic games, we mean it kind of literally. The content of that section is whimsical. It's these silly hypothetical scenarios, and you have to figure out how to answer questions about those scenarios. For example, there's a game that really cracks me up about the groups that march in a parade. There's jugglers and clowns and gymnasts, and there's all these like bizarre, kinds of people marching in the parade, and you have to put them in order. And I find it amusing because you get these groups of intellectuals, and they sit down and do this really deep thinking about the 7 groups and what order they're going to march in the parade. It's kind of funny from the teacher's perspective, but that's the logic game section. The logical reasoning section we call arguments because it has short statements, short passages that resemble arguments. And I don't mean a debate between 2 people, a disagreement. I mean an argument for something, a series of statements that try to make a claim or a conclusion. The questions that accompany these arguments are quite complex, and this section has obvious overlap with the material from law school, where you'll be reading lots of arguments. So the logical reasoning section has quickly become my favorite section, although I think most other people prefer logic games. But I really enjoy teaching logical reasoning, and if anyone would like to contact me for help with that section, I'd really enjoy doing it. The last section, the reading comprehension, is one that you're likely familiar with, in the sense that most standardized tests have long passages followed by question sets. But where the LSAT is unique is that the complexity of these questions is much higher. And these questions ask not just about the structure, but they ask complex questions about the content as well. And so you have to kind of juggle two balls where you're keeping track of the main points, but also aware of the more nuanced arguments within the passages. So I find RC to be the hardest section of the three personally, although opinions differ about which section is the easiest or hardest. So those are the three sections. And the last thing that I want to talk about before I take some questions is what exactly are they testing on these three sections? Because I think that that really helps you to understand how to prep for the LSAT. So going back to the three section types, logic games is one of the sections where students tell me frequently, I don't see what that has to do with law school. What difference does it make if I can put the coats in order in the closet? And what I tell them is it has a lot to do with law school, because what you learn when you're very precise with logic games is how to understand relationships in a very careful way, how to understand conditional statements and how to make inferences. And all of those skills, I think, are very reminiscent to me of my civil procedure class, where we just had these arbitrary rules and we had to, put deadlines in order or group the litigants according to which side of the docket they were on, or according to which state they were from, or different criteria for grouping. So I found that the diagrams that I made for logic games were actually quite useful in terms of helping me think visually through complex problems in civil procedure. The arguments section teaches you how to deconstruct arguments, how to recognize the conclusion, the premises, how to recognize different patterns of reasoning that you see over and over again. And then what I really think is fun about arguments is that that's where you learn to unpack the assumptions or the flaws of arguments, where you learn how to critique other people's arguments. And then ultimately, that's how you learn to make better arguments, by learning what weaknesses there are in arguments so that you can make sure yours don't have those weaknesses. And finally, reading comprehension is teaching some more global skills. Can you read a text and identify among all the different details? Can you identify the main point, the primary purpose, the author's attitude? And while you're doing that, can you also make proper inferences about the details themselves? So juggling act. Can you read carefully while also understanding the rhetorical structure or the overall points of the passage? So what I want to really emphasize about this slide is not the particular skills. I can't teach you those skills in a 2-minute, sitting on this one slide. But what I want to emphasize here is that none of this has to do with memorizing or knowing. All of this has to do with doing. In order to successfully navigate a logic game, you have to be able to understand the relationships that are presented to you. To do well on arguments, you have to be able to recognize the parts of new arguments that are presented that you've never seen before. To succeed on reading comprehension, you have to identify all of these elements of a passage that you're not familiar with. So in other words, what the LSAT tests is skills, not knowledge. And I emphasize that because in order to learn these skills and really perfect them, it takes time, and there is simply no substitute. There is no way to cram for the LSAT. So the bottom line, the most important take-home message from this entire presentation today is that when you're creating an LSAT study schedule, be realistic about how long it's going to take. It's going to take, for most people, 6 months or more. And if you don't give yourself 6 months or more, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure by adopting an unrealistic goal to begin with. So let's recap the points. I'm an LSAT expert. I'm from Last Call Bar Academy, and I would love it if you guys contact me if you need help with the LSAT, or if you know anyone who does. You can catch me on Facebook, Last Call Bar Academy. I am really passionate about the LSAT because I think it's the key. It's the springboard to a good legal education. This is not only how you get into law school, it's how you make it affordable. It's how you learn the reading skills that give you success as a 1L, and it's how you learn the test skills that ultimately make the bar exam manageable when you graduate. And finally, I want to impress on you guys that all three sections of the LSAT test skills, not concrete knowledge. And so one of the most important things that you have to do is give yourself a long time frame to study. You don't have to study many hours every day. You have to study consistently, and you have to study over a long period of time so that your brain has a chance to start to reroute some of your thinking processes. All right, so that's all I've got, and I'm happy to take some questions if you have any.
When you said that the LSAT could help with the affordability or so the cost of law school, what range or so would you say? Like, I think they said it's 1,052 or 60 to 1,100 is usually the average. So for someone to get a good scholarship, what should they, I guess, aim or shoot for?
Yeah, let's take a look at it. So I'm going to use SMU as an example because I know you're from the DFW area, looking at local schools, and that's one of the best ones around. So if I Google search SMU law and then median LSAT and GPA, it gives me a couple important metrics. It tells me the medians. Hold on, I'm looking at the GPA. I really want the LSAT score. Here it is. Okay, so the median LSAT at SMU is 161. What I really want to know is the 75th percentile LSAT score. The median LSAT is the one right at the middle of their class. 75th percentile is going up and saying, what if we just look at the top quarter of the class? What's the lowest LSAT score among that group? It's 163.
Okay.
So I think that to start being competitive for scholarships, you want to be in the 160s for sure.
Okay.
And that's why I tell people that the 6-month time frame is really the right mark. Most people, when they take their diagnostic test, they're somewhere in the 140s. The scale ranges from 120 to 180. Most people start off somewhere in the 140s. And typically, it doesn't take that long to shoot up 5 or 10 points. You can do that just by gaining a little familiarity with the test and drawing a couple diagrams for logic games. There's some real low-hanging fruit that will get your score up 5 or 10 points. But if you're starting in the 140s, that's not high enough. That's only going to put you into the 150s. To get the next 5 or 10 points, there's where it really becomes a grind. You hit that plateau, and then there's no more low-hanging fruit. At that point, you actually have to go back and learn new reading skills, new test-taking skills, new thinking skills. And there's where your brain simply can't do it quickly. It has to create new neural networks, new patterns of thought. It's like learning a new song. The first time you hear it, you don't know it. And you have to listen to it over and over and over again before it becomes committed to memory. But if you are diligent about the process, if you listen to the song every day, you might eventually reach a point where it becomes such an ingrained part of your memory that you never forget it. That's the kind of studying that I advocate. It's like the amateur learns something until he gets it right. The professional reviews it until he can't get it wrong. That's the difference between 150 and 160. The 150 students know how to get questions right, but they don't know how to do the questions in a manner where they can't get them wrong. And it's just diligence and practice. That's how you get there. So give yourself plenty of time. That's the main thing. Set up a very organized study schedule. I can help you with it if you want. Reach out to me. And make sure that you're studying 5 or 10 hours a week, whatever your bandwidth is, and that it's consistent. You can't take weeks and weeks off. You can't have months off. It has to be, it's like fitness. You have to be consistently building on your previous work.
Right.
And you can't be asking too much. Exactly like fitness. You can't say, well, I'm busy this week, so I'm going to double up the following week. That's not how your brain works. It's not how your body works. It's fine to take a week off, provided that you've given yourself a long enough time frame so that you can just come back the following week and resume your schedule, not try to double up. That's not a viable way to learn. Not this skill anyway. I've seen many people try, and I've seen many people fail. The LSAT is an intellectual beast. It's
Yeah, I know,
really, really tricky test.
I know you stated that you might have to come up with new like test taking techniques or so. With your experience with the LSAT, with there being like multiple different sections, but primarily those main three that you listed, did you notice that it'll be better if I start with the RC section first because you stated it was harder, or was it just going straight through? It didn't matter which section.
When I work with students who are starting from scratch, I usually have them start with logic games, then go to logical reasoning, and then reading comp last. And the reason I have them do it is this: logic games teach you how to think logically. They're asking you to take these rules of the game and create the proper deductions, the proper results, the right outcomes. There's nothing, I don't want to say that it's easy, but there's nothing tricky about it. The outcomes, they might not be hard to find, but they are all consistent with the rules. When you move to logical reasoning, the argument section, it's a little bit harder to teach students because we're not playing by the rules anymore. The arguments are bad. The premises of the arguments don't prove the conclusions. And a big task of the LR section is being able to explain or figure out why not. Why aren't those premises good enough to draw the particular conclusion that they've tried to draw? So the analogy that I give is it's kind of like if they gave you a logic game, and instead of asking you for the correct answers, what if they gave you the wrong answers to the questions and said, why is this question wrong? And why is this answer wrong? That's basically what they do on the argument section. They give you a bunch of bad reasoning and then say, what's wrong with it? Explain to me why that's a bad conclusion, why that's a bad answer. That's tricky for students. Sometimes they can't make the transition from correct, valid logic to describing and appreciating flawed logic. And then finally, I think that if you get really good at LR, that basically translates over to your RC skills. So that's the final section. Dr. Watson is saying in the comments here that she calls it the brisket method, study low and slow. It's exactly right. Low pressure studying is more fun. I do 1L tutoring with students, and so they have a very high reading load, and I have to do it with them, so I'm ready for our weekly meeting. And when I get busy and I have to cram at the end of the week for my tutoring sessions, I hate it. I wish I didn't have those tutoring engagements. When I start early in the week and I do a little bit each day, I find secured transactions to be fascinating. Something that is not fascinating, very technical and dry, but it's all a matter of my context. Am I doing this leisurely with, and giving myself the ability to make mistakes, or are the stakes so high where every error that I make is putting me further and further behind? I don't enjoy that kind of learning.
All right. Did you when you took your LSAT, did you have to take it multiple times, or did you prepare and have adequate enough time where it was just a one-shot try?
That's an interesting question. I'm in somewhat of an anomaly because I had studied so many tests before I took the LSAT that my goals were very different. So the first time I took the test, I scored 171, and that was very disappointing to me, whereas I think most people would find that to be an end goal where they would never take it again. So I retook it, and I scored 174 my second time, which was also disappointing to me, below my practice test scores. But the reason why I share all this is not to brag about my scores, but because it made absolutely no difference, my retake. What the scholarship that I earned and the admission that I earned were locked in place before I got the results for my retake. And then when I went back to the school and I said, will you reconsider my scholarship? I got a higher score. They laughed at me. They said, you got a full scholarship. We're not renegotiating that. So, so at the end of the day, I did take it twice, but it didn't matter. For most test takers, I think it's become almost essential to take the test more than once. I hate to say that, because it's expensive and it consumes your life to study for the LSAT and take the LSAT. But they changed the reporting rules a few years back, and they made it so that the law schools could report each of their students' single highest LSAT scores rather than averaging them all. And when this happened, all the students cheered and they said, yay, now we can take the test more than once and we don't get punished for a single bad score. But in the background, my eyes were wide. I was like, no, no, no. Now you are requiring yourself to take it more than once. It's not now we can take it more than once. Now it's if you don't, you're stuck with your first score. So I
Right.
actually think that this turned out really bad for the test taker. The incentive now is just to obtain the single highest LSAT score you can by any means that you can do it. And if that entails several attempts, then that's what it entails.
Mhm. I know you stated that you took practice exams or so, and that's uh, a repeating, I guess, or so I guess tactic or so that a lot of lawyers or so stated is that they did a lot of practice exams. Based off of your practice exam scores to what you actually had, how much of a difference or so would you notice it? Was it just 30 or so points, or was it a lot more than that?
Yeah, well, definitely not 30. You know, a significant score drop would be 3, 4, 5 points. Remember, the scale is a little different from the SAT scale. It's 120 to 180. Um, so most people experience a score decline. I don't know if this is true. I should say I observe within my students that it's very common for them to have a score decline on the official test compared to their practice test scores. And I think we can account for that a couple ways. The stress is higher on the real test. I think that sometimes people fudge on practice tests a little bit. You know, the dog's barking, maybe they'll pause the test and go square the dog away and then come back. And, you know, I mean, it's not a big fudge, but it is a mental reset that you won't have,
Get
you know,
during
be
that
able
real
to
time.
do on the real test. And then also people tend to take longer breaks during a practice test than they are really allotted during the real test. So if you add up a number of differences between your practice environment and the official test, it usually adds up to a small underperformance, you know, a couple points lower than your practice test scores.
That's typically what my students report as well, as a drop of anywhere from 2 to 4 points, usually right around 3. And I will note that while students now often do take the test more than once, many of them seem to think that simply retaking the test is all they need to do.
Mm,
And I see their scores, and I can tell you that the vast majority of them do not improve from first
The
test to
first-
second test, even by a point or two. So
it's
if
true.
you're going to retake the test, only do that if you're going to do something different.
Okay, understood. And I know I had a classmate last semester who was actually taking it, and he said that one of the hardest things is really the time. But I
Yes.
didn't actually get to ask in the time allotted. So exactly how long are you allowed to take the LSAT for?
Well, you get 35 minutes for each section, assuming
Mm,
you don't have any accommodations. And the sections have 24 to 26 questions on each section. So the time constraints are extreme. And one of the things that you alluded to earlier was learning new test strategies that you haven't needed in the past. One of them is time management. It's very rare that a test taker can complete all the questions in a given section. And so learning how to manage your time and how to allocate your time on manageable questions and how to recognize questions that are time traps or simply unmanageable for your skill level, that becomes a very important skill. Just recognizing what you have time to do and what you don't have time to do, and then acting on that, in a smart way. Most people don't. Most people, when you put the time pressure on, their intuitive reaction is go faster, but that causes you to sacrifice accuracy on everything. And I think what the LSAT is trying to teach students is you're better off going slower and doing things well and then leaving certain things undone than you are just doing everything carelessly. I don't think that everyone gets that message, because when students come to me, they usually ask me, how do I get faster? How do I finish the section? And I tell them, you stop trying to finish the section. You just acknowledge that you're not going to be able to finish every question with 100% efficiency. And therefore you allocate your time in a smarter way. And when you get down to the last 5 minutes, then you make your final few choices. But you don't get hung up early on time traps with the assumption that you're going to finish everything. It's a foolish time management strategy. I definitely spend a lot of time talking about time management with my students. There's something I want to share with you. I do 2 pro bono sessions every week where I just show up and answer questions. And so if you follow this Facebook page in the chat, Last Call Bar Academy Facebook page, you'll see that every Wednesday at noon Central, and then every Thursday at 7 Central, I get online and take questions. So, and that's completely free. Most people who like those sessions end up buying my classes or my services because they have to compete too much for my attention in a group session. But if you just want to come see what I do and get a sense of how I teach and what kinds of study methods I advocate, come listen to some of the free stuff.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Any other questions, Alex?
I know you mentioned with the argument you have to understand, I guess, the argument. I'm doing some communication classes. When you say that, are you saying that we will have to like like the post hoc argument or the slippery slope? Is that kind of what you were referring to? Like we'd have to know just those type of arguments when they're being presented to us?
I think at one time the LR section was predicated largely on classical flaws, but those have been packaged and learned so well that I don't think that they can gain as much traction testing those same classical flaws. So what I find is that the newest LR sections have gotten significantly more complex, and they require you to understand rhetoric and argumentation in an affirmative way, not just in a negative way. What I mean by that is that in the older LR sections, I think that just knowing the flaws would get you pretty far. But now I think that you have to be better at knowing the valid forms of logic so that it doesn't matter what kind of flaw they show you, you can spot it. And it doesn't matter how they describe it in the answer choices, because they are presenting flaws that are not typical, number one. And then even when they are typical, the answer choices on the newer exams are not using the traditional language to describe the flaws. They're not just coming right out and saying correlation doesn't equal causation anymore. They're getting more granular with it and saying, well, they didn't specify the mechanism of the causal claim. So it is getting a little more tricky. And what I've been teaching students is that if you understand how a valid argument works, they can't trick you with an invalid one. You can always compare it to your model and say, here's what we needed to prove that conclusion. Here's what they gave me, and it wasn't that. Okay. But if you're constantly relying on flaws, if all you know is a huge library of flawed arguments, then you're just a slave to recognizing the flaws that you've already been exposed to. LR is my favorite section to teach. And so I've actually invented a logic language to help people understand logical flaws and the sophisticated types of fallacies that they're testing. And this logic language that I invented, it's visual. So I show students images of the argument where we put different statements in different boxes and we map out the connections. We say, look, this statement supports this part of the conclusion and this one here supports that part of the conclusion, but we're missing a premise to support this part of the conclusion. And so it becomes a physical map with a visual component. I really love LR. And if you want to talk about flaws, you could get me started on that topic. We're about to publish our product this summer. It's called Circuit Logic, and it entails a purely visual, illustrative approach to thinking about arguments and logic. So to answer your question, I think that knowing the flaws is helpful, and it's a good first step. But ultimately, you'll need to understand logic in a slightly deeper way to be able to spot some of the flaws that don't conform to those classical descriptions.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sure.
Alex, while I think the way that COM teaches argumentation and debate is really helpful for debate and interaction with people, I think you'll find that in terms of courses, that the way that argumentation is taught in logic and critical thinking in the philosophy class, which used to be called Introduction to Logic, that is actually a more useful approach for the LSAT. Because as Keith pointed out, it's not about an exchange with another person. You're simply reading arguments in a text. So it's a very different approach.
I can't underscore what you just said enough, because I have students often, always, like very, very frequently, students come to me with a lot of misconceptions about the idea of an assumption. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that when we're engaged with another person and we're talking about assuming as a verb, we mean something different than when we're talking about a logical assumption in a cold argument that has no other person to engage with. There's no mind that's making the assumption. It's just a logical component of the statements themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think that this tends to live more in the philosophy departments and the formal logic realm than it does in the communications department.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. You're asking a lot of good questions, Alex. So obviously you've done some thinking about this.
Thank you. I'm currently, I think that was actually the last of my questions that I had at that time. Everything you guys have stated has been extremely helpful in mind opening.
I just put my email address in the chat, and the message above that is my Facebook page. So what I'd like for you to do, Alex, is reach out to me if you want to keep chatting about this. And I'd also appreciate it if you share my contact information with anyone you know who's interested in law school or LSAT prep.
Yes, sir. I definitely will. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alex, for showing up. And thank you so much, Keith, for coming and doing this event. I will certainly share the video with my list, and I'll share your contact information there as well, if that's okay.
Yes, I'd be grateful for it. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Take care. And I'm sure I'll talk to you again soon, Alex.
Yes, ma'am. You guys have a blessed rest of your day.
Okay. Bye-bye. Yeah. Thanks, Keith.
Sure.